The truck had barely been there 3 days. It sat at the edge of the driveway, dusty from the long haul across 2 counties, a battered old workhorse of a vehicle that looked exactly like what it was, a man's truck, loaded with the ordinary weight of a life in transition. The moving boxes had only just stopped arriving. The kitchen still smelled like someone else's cooking, and Deputy Marcus Hale, newly sworn in as the county's next sheriff, was standing at the window with a cup of coffee, watching the morning light fall across a neighborhood he was only just beginning to think of as home when the flatbed rolled slowly around the corner and everything that had been quiet stopped being quiet. The woman who stepped down from the passenger side of the tow company's lead vehicle moved with a particular energy of someone who had been waiting a long time for exactly this moment. She was dressed in what could only be described as the uniform of institutional authority, pressed khakis, a polo shirt bearing a small embroidered logo, a clipboard in her left hand, and a pen already uncapped in her right. She was not rushing. She did not need to rush. She had the rules on her side, and she had the tow truck behind her. And she had 3 years of experience reminding people in this neighborhood exactly where the lines were drawn. Her name was Karen Whitmore. She was 45 years old. She was president of the Cedarwood Glen Homeowners Association. And at that particular moment, she had no idea that the man whose truck she was about to have removed was the single most consequential person she would ever make an enemy of. Marcus set down his coffee. He watched her cross the lawn toward his front door. He recognized the clipboard. He had seen that posture before in courtrooms, in precincts, in the offices of people who confused the authority they had been given with the authority they believed they deserved. He was not alarmed. He was not angry. Not yet. He was simply a man who had moved into a new neighborhood and was about to have a conversation he had not planned to have before 9 in the morning. Marcus Webb had spent 22 years in law enforcement. He had worked patrol in the valley, investigative work in the city, 2 terms as undersheriff before the election that placed him at the top of the county's law enforcement structure. He was not a man who needed to announce himself. He was not a man who wore his badge at the dinner table or dropped his title into casual conversation. When his neighbors had knocked on the door over the previous 3 days to introduce themselves, he had told them his name was Marcus, that he worked in county government, and that he was glad to be there. None of that was a lie. None of it was the complete truth. He had chosen, deliberately and without apology, to let people meet him as a person before they met him as a position. It was the kind of choice that only people who understood the weight of a title could make cleanly. The neighborhood itself was exactly the kind of place Marcus had been looking for. Wide streets lined with mature oaks, houses set back from the road with careful landscaping, a tone of quiet prosperity that didn't feel aggressive. He had grown up in a smaller town, and something about the scale of Cedarwood Glen felt right to him. It was the kind of community where, on a good day, people brought each other food when someone was sick and kept an eye on each other's houses when someone was away. He had seen that, those first 3 days. He had also seen, in the careful way 2 of his closest neighbors averted their eyes when Karen Whitmore's name came up in conversation, that not every day in Cedarwood Glen was a good one. He opened the door before she knocked. Karen Whitmore looked up from her clipboard with the expression of someone whose script had just been disrupted. She recovered quickly. She always recovered quickly. "Good morning," she said, and her tone made it clear that the morning's quality was entirely conditional. "I'm Karen Whitmore, president of the Cedarwood Glen Homeowners Association. I assume you received the welcome packet we left on your doorstep when you moved in?" Marcus said he had received it. He had, in fact, read most of it. He told her that. Karen nodded, as though this were the correct answer, but just barely. She tapped the clipboard. "Then you're aware that the community's guidelines prohibit the parking of commercial vehicles in residential driveways or on public streets within the community boundaries for periods exceeding 24 hours. She paused. "Your vehicle," she said, glancing toward the truck with an expression that managed to combine disapproval and something that looked very much like satisfaction, "has been parked in that location for approximately 72 hours. Marcus explained, quietly and without defensiveness, that he had been in the process of moving, that the truck had been used to transport items that could not fit in a standard moving van, that he had been intending to move it to his garage once he had cleared enough space inside to accommodate it. He explained that he had been in the middle of that process, and that he was aware of the guidelines, and that he appreciated her bringing it to his attention. Karen listened to all of this, with the expression of a judge who has already written the verdict. "I appreciate your explanation," she said, and the word appreciate landed like a gavel. "However, The guidelines don't include a grace period for moving. The rule exists for the benefit of all residents. I'll need you to relocate the vehicle by noon today, or the association will be forced to take further action. She extended the clipboard toward him. I'll also need your signature acknowledging receipt of this notice. Marcus looked at the notice. He signed it. He thanked her. She left. And Marcus Webb, the new sheriff of the county, stood in his doorway and watched her walk back across his lawn with the unhurried certainty of someone who had just won a small but important battle, and he thought not for the first time, and not for the last, that the most dangerous people in any community are not the ones who break the rules, but the ones who have convinced themselves that the rules were written specifically for them to enforce. He did not move the truck by noon. He meant to. The morning got away from him in the way mornings do during a move. There were calls to take, boxes to unpack, a problem with the water pressure in the master bathroom that turned into a 2-hour conversation with a plumber. By the time he looked up, it was 2 in the afternoon, and a new notice was on his windshield. The notices multiplied over the following week with a speed and creativity that Marcus found, despite himself, genuinely impressive. There was a notice about the placement of his recycling bins. They had been set at an angle to the curb that technically violated the guidelines governing receptacle positioning during collection days. There was a notice about a section of his front lawn where the grass had grown to a height that exceeded the maximum permitted by the community standards 3.5 inches, where 3 inches was the stated limit. There was a notice about a cardboard box that had remained on his front porch for more than the 4-hour window permitted for items awaiting disposal. Each notice was formally worded. Each notice cited the specific provision being violated. Each notice arrived with a copy kept on record by the HOA office. Marcus dealt with each one methodically. He adjusted the bins. He mowed the lawn. He brought the box inside. He did not complain. He did not escalate. He was a man who had spent more than 2 decades navigating bureaucratic systems far more consequential than a homeowners association, and he understood that sometimes the correct response to petty authority is patience. He also understood because he was observant, because observation was the foundation of everything he had ever been good at, that Karen Whitmore's campaign against him was not random. His neighbors told him things in the careful sideways way that people share information when they are afraid of the person they are sharing it about. A retired teacher named Dorothy, who lived 2 houses down on the left, told him over the fence one evening that Karen had gone after the Hendersons when they installed a mailbox post that was 4 inches taller than the approved standard. A couple named Phil and Renata, who lived across the street, told him that Karen had reported their teenage son to the association for shooting basketball in the driveway after 9 in the evening, technically a noise violation under a provision that most residents hadn't known existed. Nobody had ever successfully challenged Karen Whitmore. Nobody had ever tried. The HOA's enforcement process was opaque enough, and Karen's control over it was complete enough, that confronting her felt, to most people, like fighting the weather. Marcus listened to all of this. He took mental notes, which was a habit so deeply ingrained that he no longer noticed he was doing it. He did not tell any of his neighbors who he was. He thanked them for the information. He smiled. He went back inside. The truck was still there on the morning of the 10th day when Karen Whitmore made the call. She had been watching it. Marcus knew this, the way he knew most things, through a combination of observation, inference, and the kind of pattern recognition that comes from 2 decades of reading situations. He had seen her silver sedan slow as it passed his house on 2 separate evenings. He had seen her standing at the corner of the block on a Tuesday morning, clipboard in hand, looking in the direction of his driveway with an expression of focused intention. He had known, with the calm certainty of someone who has watched a storm building on the horizon, that this was coming. He had simply not known exactly when. The flatbed truck arrived at 8:47 in the morning. It was a white vehicle, with the name of the towing company printed in blue letters on the door. The driver was a broad-shouldered man of about 30, with the kind of face that suggested he spent most of his working life outdoors, and the kind of eyes that suggested he paid attention to what he saw. He pulled up to the curb in front of Marcus's house, with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this 100 times, and he stepped down from the cab and walked around to the back to begin the process of preparing the equipment, because that was what he had been called to do, and that was what he intended to do. Karen Whitmore was already there. She had arrived before the truck, which meant she had timed this deliberately, which meant she wanted to be present for it. She was standing at the edge of the property with the clipboard and the expression of someone overseeing the correct execution of a procedure they have anticipated for a long time. A few neighbors had drifted to the edges of their lawns and driveways, not quite gathering, Not quite not gathering, in the way that people do when something is happening that they don't fully understand yet but suspect they should be watching. Marcus came to the door when he heard the truck. He stood on the porch. He watched. He had his coffee again, the same cup, or one indistinguishable from it, and he drank it slowly and said nothing. Karen caught his eye and held it with the flat, steady gaze of someone who has rehearsed this moment. "Mr. Webb," she said, loud enough for the neighbors to hear, "the Homeowners Association has determined that your vehicle remains in violation of the community parking guidelines. Given your failure to comply with 3 separate written notices, the association is exercising its right to arrange for the removal of the vehicle at your expense." The tow truck driver had been working at the back of his truck. At the sound of Karen's voice, he had looked up. Now he walked around to the front of Marcus's truck and began positioning the equipment for the hookup. He was moving with the steady, professional cadence of someone doing a job they know how to do, and he was not looking at Marcus. And then he was. The driver's name was Danny Ferris. He was 31 years old. He had been driving for the county's primary tow contractor for 6 years, and in that time he had attended, as a required observer, 2 briefings at the county sheriff's department, one on protocol for impounded vehicles in criminal investigations, and one, approximately 3 weeks prior, on the transition of department leadership following the retirement of the previous sheriff. At that second briefing, the incoming sheriff had been introduced. There had been a photograph on a projected screen. There had been a handshake in a hallway afterward, brief and professional. Danny Ferris had a good memory for faces. He was looking at one of those faces right now. Danny straightened up slowly. He looked at Marcus. He looked at the truck. He looked at Karen Whitmore. And then he looked back at Marcus with an expression that moved through several distinct stages: recognition, calculation, and finally a very specific quality of discomfort that a person gets when they realize they are standing at the exact center of something that is about to become significantly more complicated than it appeared. He walked over to Karen. He spoke quietly enough that the neighbors could not hear him clearly, though they leaned in the way people do. He said, "Ma'am, I think you might want to double-check on this one." Karen looked at him with the expression she reserved for people who expressed hesitation in the execution of her instructions. "Is there a problem?" Danny glanced at Marcus. He looked back at Karen. "I just think it might be worth making a call before we proceed. There may be some context here that changes the picture a little." "The context," Karen said, in a tone that put the word in quotation marks, "is that this vehicle is in violation of the association's clearly stated parking regulations and that the owner has been given ample opportunity to correct the situation. There is no additional context that is relevant to this process." She wrote something on her clipboard. "Please proceed." Danny did not immediately proceed. He stood where he was for a moment, and in that moment Marcus saw him working through it, the job versus the judgment, the contract versus the thing he knew that Karen Whitmore did not know. Marcus almost said something. He came very close to saying something, but there was a part of him, the part that had learned, over 22 years, that sometimes the most important information is the information that reveals itself, that held still and waited. Karen turned to face the gathering neighbors. There were 8 or 9 of them now, drifted close enough that the fiction of casual proximity no longer held. She addressed them with the tone of someone making a statement for the record. "This is exactly what the association's guidelines exist to prevent," she said. "When residents disregard the rules that protect the quality and character of this community, the association has both the right and the responsibility to act. No one is above the rules here. Not long-term residents. Certainly not newcomers who arrive with." She paused. And the pause was pointed, and what filled the pause was a glance at the old truck that communicated everything she intended it to communicate with apparent disregard for the standards that their neighbors have worked to maintain. Dorothy, the retired teacher, made a small sound that was not quite a word. Phil, across the street, put his hands in his pockets and looked at the ground. Danny Ferris had gone back to the truck equipment. He was moving more slowly now. Every motion had the quality of a man performing a required action at the absolute minimum required pace. He looked at Marcus one more time, and Marcus, who had been still and quiet on the porch through all of it, gave the smallest possible nod. It was the kind of nod that means, "I see you, I know what you know, do what you have to do." It was at that precise moment that a county vehicle turned onto the street. The car was an unmarked sedan, but it was unmistakably official, the kind of vehicle that people in law enforcement recognize instantly and that civilians learn to recognize almost as quickly. It pulled up behind the flatbed with a quiet authority that needed no announcement. The door opened. A young deputy named Aaron Cross stepped out, and he walked directly toward the porch with the focused stride of someone who had a specific destination and was not confused about what it was. "Sheriff Webb," he said, and his voice carried clearly in the morning quiet. "Sorry to interrupt. We have an update on the Raleigh County coordination you asked for. If you have a moment." The effect was immediate and absolute. It moved through the gathered neighbors like a current visible in the way heads turned and eyes widened, and the particular silence that falls when a piece of information reorganizes everything around it. Karen Whitmore's pen stopped moving on her clipboard. Her head came up. She looked at Deputy Cross. She looked at Marcus. She looked back at Cross. Danny Ferris, who had been hunched over the tow equipment, went completely still. Marcus stepped down from the porch. He was still holding his coffee. He said, "Give me just 1 minute, Aaron," and he crossed the lawn toward Karen Whitmore with the unhurried step of a man who has never, in his professional life, needed to demonstrate urgency in order to be taken seriously. Karen Whitmore was looking at him the way people look at something they are trying to reclassify in real time, the same data, reorganizing itself into a completely different picture. Her lips parted slightly. She said nothing. "Karen," Marcus said, and his voice had the same quality it always had, calm, clear, without performance. "I want to be straightforward with you. I was planning to move the truck this weekend. I should have communicated that more clearly, and I apologize for not doing that." He paused. "I also want to say that I have no intention of using my position to avoid any legitimate community process. If the association has a valid complaint, I'll address it through the appropriate channel." He looked at her clipboard, then at her face. "But I do think we should probably talk about how that process has been applied in this neighborhood. Not today, when we've both had a chance to sit down properly." Karen Whitmore opened her mouth. She closed it. She opened it again. "I was simply enforcing—" "I know what you were doing," Marcus said. Not unkindly, definitively. "I'll be in touch." He walked back toward Deputy Cross. Behind him, the gathered neighbors began talking in the quiet, urgent way of people who have just witnessed something that will be discussed for a very long time. Danny Ferris straightened up and began disconnecting the equipment from Marcus's truck with the patient efficiency of a man who had made the right call and knew it. What followed in the days after that morning was less dramatic than the morning itself, but more consequential. Word travels in a neighborhood at a speed that has nothing to do with formal communication, and within 48 hours, every resident of Cedarwood Glen who had ever received a notice from the HOA, every resident who had ever been called to account for a fraction of an inch violation or a receptacle placed at the wrong angle, every resident who had swallowed frustration and adjusted their behavior and wondered quietly whether any of it was actually fair, all of them knew that the man who had just moved into the corner house on Elm Ridge Drive was the new sheriff of the county, and that Karen Whitmore had sent a tow truck to his property, and that the tow truck driver had known something Karen had not. The calls began coming. "Are you community? Are liaison office? Are you cove? Are you cove? Are you cove?" The calls began coming into the county's communities that shared the same HOA management structure. They were not, at first, complaints about Karen Whitmore specifically. They were questions carefully worded, tentative questions about what options existed for residents who believed that a homeowners association had applied its rules selectively or without proper procedural foundation. The liaison office, following established protocol, began logging the inquiries. On the 4th day, the volume of inquiries triggered a standard review flag. The flag went to the county attorney's office. The county attorney's office sent a request to the HOA's management company for documentation of enforcement actions over the preceding 3 years. Marcus Webb did not make any of these calls. He did not instruct anyone else to make them. He had told his neighbors, in a series of conversations that were brief and consistent in their message, that if they had concerns about how the HOA had been managing enforcement, the appropriate path was through the county's established community governance review process, and that the process existed for exactly this kind of situation, and that it worked when people used it. He said this to Dorothy over the fence. He said it to Phil and Renata across the street. He said it to a quiet, watchful man named Gerald who lived at the end of the block, and who had, it turned out, been keeping records of every notice he had received from the HOA for the past 2 years, organized by date and provision, in a binder in his kitchen cabinet. Gerald produced the binder with the careful pride of someone who had never expected it to be relevant, and was now discovering that it was exactly what was needed. The county review that followed was formal, methodical, and to anyone who understood how these processes worked, deeply uncomfortable for Karen Whitmore. The documentation that came in from the HOA's management company was extensive, and it told a story that was not, in its individual details, particularly dramatic, but that accumulated into something that was very difficult to look at without acknowledging what it was. Enforcement actions had been concentrated not uniformly across the community, but in specific patterns. Certain households received notices at rates significantly higher than their neighbors, regardless of visible compliance. Certain provisions were enforced rigorously against some residents and apparently not at all against others. The procedural requirements for escalating from warning to enforcement action requirements that existed in the HOA's own governing documents and that were, in several cases, legally mandated had been bypassed on a number of occasions. In one instance, a towing action had been initiated without the required final notice. In several others, fines had been assessed without the written appeal process being made available to the resident. The county attorney's office presented its findings to the HOA's board of directors at a meeting that was, by several accounts, the most attended community governance meeting in Cedarwood Glen's 12-year history. Residents who had never set foot in an HOA meeting sat in folding chairs along the walls and stood at the back of the room. Karen Whitmore sat at the board table with the posture of someone who is prepared for a battle and is beginning to understand that the battle is already over. The findings were not criminal. They were procedural violations, serious ones, and ones with real consequences for real people, but violations of process rather than violations of law. What the county attorney made clear, in the measured and thorough language of someone who had prepared carefully, was that the HOA's enforcement practices had departed significantly from both its own governing documents and from the county's requirements for community governance organizations. Remediation would be required. External oversight would be imposed for a minimum of 18 months. And the board would need to address the question of whether its current leadership structure was capable of implementing the required changes. The board meeting ran for 3 hours. The vote of no confidence in Karen Whitmore as association president passed by a margin of 7-1. The one dissenting vote was Karen's own. She sat at the table after the vote while the room around her gradually emptied. Residents filed out in 2s and 3s, speaking in the hushed but energized tones of people who have just collectively exhaled something they have been holding for a very long time. Dorothy stopped on her way out and looked at Karen for a moment with an expression that was not triumph and was not pity, but was something more complicated than either the look of a woman who had been on the receiving end of petty authority for long enough that its removal felt less like a victory than like the simple, overdue restoration of something that should never have been taken. She said nothing. She walked out. Marcus was not at the board meeting. He had been invited, and he had declined, because his presence at the meeting would have made it about him rather than about the process, and the process was what mattered. He heard about the vote from Phil, who called him that evening with the particular vocal energy of a man who has been waiting a long time to make this specific phone call. The Saturday after the vote, Marcus was in his driveway doing the kind of maintenance on the truck that the truck had been needing for several weeks: an oil change, a check of the brake fluid, the minor attentions that a vehicle accumulates when its owner has been occupied with other things. He heard a car slow at the curb and looked up to find Danny Ferris leaning out the window of a personal vehicle, an older model in need of its own maintenance, with the expression of a man who has been carrying a small weight and is prepared to set it down. "Figured I'd stop by," Danny said. He got out of the car. He was still in work clothes, which meant he had come directly from a job. He stood at the edge of the driveway with his hands in his pockets, and the kind of posture that people adopt when they are prepared to apologize but are not entirely sure whether the apology is necessary. "I should have been clearer that morning," he said. "When she told me to proceed, I could have been more direct about why I thought it was a problem." Marcus set down the wrench. He looked at Danny Ferris with the direct, uncomplicated regard of a man who does not use eye contact as a tool. "You tried to slow it down," he said, "more than once. She didn't want to hear it." He paused. "You did what you could. I knew who you were," Danny said. "From the briefing. I know you did. I thought she should know before she went any further." Danny's jaw moved slightly. "I didn't think it would go the way it went." "None of this went the way anybody thought it would," Marcus said. He picked up the wrench again, considered it for a moment, and set it down again on the truck's running board. "The thing is, it shouldn't have mattered who I was. That's the part that I want people to take out of this. She was wrong about the way she was treating people before she ever knocked on my door. The fact that she did it to someone who turned out to be the county sheriff, that's not what made it wrong. It was already wrong." Danny nodded slowly. He understood this, or he understood it enough that he would continue to understand it more clearly over time, which is how most people come to understand important things. They talked for a few more minutes, the easy, undemanding conversation of two men standing in a driveway on a Saturday morning with no particular agenda. Danny asked about the truck. Marcus told him about the truck, where he'd gotten it, how many miles were on it, the particular stubborn affection a person develops for a vehicle that has never once let them down even when it looks like it might. Danny, who drove for a living and had the evaluation habits of a man who has spent years assessing other people's vehicles, looked at the truck with a professional appreciation that had nothing to do with appearances. "She's got a few good years left," he said. "More than a few," Marcus said. Karen Whitmore came to Marcus's door on a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks after the vote. She came without the clipboard. She came without the polo shirt with the HOA logo. She was wearing a jacket and carrying nothing but her car keys, and when Marcus opened the door, she stood on the porch with the particular bearing of a person who has rehearsed a thing so many times that the words have stopped feeling like their own. "I want to explain," she began. Marcus held the door and she came inside, and they sat in the kitchen that still had the faint smell of someone else's cooking, though less so now, and Karen Whitmore talked about the things that people talk about when they are trying to explain how they became something they didn't intend to become. She talked about the neighborhood 10 years ago, before it was what it was now, when the HOA had been a loose and informal thing, and properties had been allowed to decline in ways that affected everyone. She talked about taking on the presidency because no one else would, and learning the rules because the rules had been loosely applied for too long, and discovering this was the part she said most carefully, as though she was only now saying it fully for the first time, that having the authority to enforce the rules felt like something she had not had before, not in her marriage, which had ended, not in her job, which had been reorganized out from under her, not in the various places where she had tried to matter and had found the edges of how much she was allowed to matter. The HOA had given her a domain, a small one, but hers. Marcus listened to all of this without interrupting. He was good at listening. It was, he had always believed, the most underrated skill in law enforcement, and in life generally, the ability to hear what a person was saying beneath the thing they thought they were saying. When she finished, he said, "The rules exist to protect people, all the people in the community, not just the ones who have always been here, and not primarily the person who's in charge of enforcing them." He looked at her directly. When the rules start serving one person's need to feel powerful, they stop being rules. They become something else. Karen looked at the table between them. "I know that," she said quietly. "I think I knew it before this. She stopped. "You got used to it," Marcus said, not cruelly, as a statement of fact. "Yes," she said, "I got used to it." There was a long silence in the kitchen. Outside, the October light was going down behind the oaks on the street, and the neighborhood was taking on the particular quality of early evening in a quiet place, the sound of a car arriving home, the bark of a dog 3 houses down, the warm domestic ambient noise of people settling into the end of the day. Cedarwood Glen. A real place, with real people, getting on with their real lives. Karen left without ceremony. They did not shake hands. They did not make promises about anything, but there was something in the way she carried herself down the porch steps, more weight in some places, less in others, that was different from every other time Marcus had watched her walk away. Whether that difference was lasting, whether it would translate into the slower, harder work of actually changing the habits of a lifetime, Marcus did not know. He was not an optimist or a pessimist about human nature. He was a realist with sufficient experience to know that people could change and that most people found it very difficult, and that the circumstances that created the conditions for change were rarely tidy. What he knew, sitting in his kitchen with the door closed against the October evening, was that the change that had happened in Cedarwood Glen over the preceding weeks was not the result of revenge. It was not the result of anyone being humiliated or defeated in a satisfying way. It was the result of a process imperfect, slow, frustrating to people who wanted resolution faster, doing what processes are supposed to do. People had spoken up. Records had been kept. Channels that exist for exactly these situations had been used. A structure that had been operating outside its own rules had been brought back within them. That was all. And it was everything. The new HOA board had its first official meeting in November. The chair was a woman named Elise Marbury, a landscape architect who had lived in the neighborhood for 7 years and who had, in that time, accumulated a detailed understanding of which rules existed for genuinely good reasons and which ones had been invented by successive boards with varying agendas. She brought to the role a quality that Karen Whitmore had never had and had perhaps never understood: the necessity of the willingness to ask before enforcing anything, whether enforcing it would actually serve the people the rule was designed to protect. The meetings were open and minutes were posted, and the appeals process was explained to every new resident as a matter of course. It was not a perfect system. There is no perfect system, but it was a system operating in the direction of its actual purpose, which is more than can be said for many systems. Marcus came to the first meeting. He sat in the back row, which was the row where he always sat when he attended community events in his own neighborhood, the row that said, "I am here as a resident, not as anything else." Dorothy sat next to him and passed him a printed agenda and told him about the proposal on the agenda for a neighborhood tree planting initiative, and Marcus looked at the agenda and thought that it was a very good proposal, and he said so, and Dorothy smiled in the particular way of someone who has been saying so for years and is glad to have the company. The truck was still in the driveway. Marcus had not moved it to the garage. He had cleared enough space for it, but he had come to the conclusion, without making a formal decision about it, that the truck's presence in the driveway suited him. It sat there in the morning light and in the evening shadow, and through the gray Ohio weather of November, with the solid, uncomplicated confidence of a thing that knows exactly what it is. His neighbors passed it on their way in and out, and none of them had anything to say about it, because there was nothing to say about it. It was a truck. It belonged to the man who lived there. It had been there for weeks and would probably be there for years, and the neighborhood was going to be fine. Some of the people who had been afraid in this place were not afraid anymore. That was not a small thing. It was, in fact, the thing. Justice, when it is functioning the way it is meant to function, does not look like punishment. It does not look like a dramatic reversal or a satisfying humiliation or the clean resolution of a story that has found its proper ending. It looks like a retired teacher passing an agenda to her neighbor in the back row of a community meeting. It looks like a tow truck driver driving by a house and not stopping, because there is nothing there that needs to be addressed. It looks like rules applied with the question always present: who does this protect? And is that who it was written to protect? And are we applying it the same way to everyone? It looks, mostly, like people going about their lives in the reasonable expectation that the structures around them are working as intended, not for anyone's personal advantage, not in service of anyone's need to feel powerful, but for the community as a whole. That expectation, when it is earned, is not dramatic. It is simply the normal condition of a decent place to live. Marcus Webb drove through the neighborhood on a Thursday morning in late November, on his way to the office, in the old truck, and the oaks had lost most of their leaves, and the morning was cold and clear, and Cedarwood Glen looked exactly like what it was, a neighborhood where people lived, and where the rules that governed how they lived together were, increasingly, serving the people they were meant to serve. He turned onto the main road. The truck moved well. It had always moved well. He had no reason to look back, and he didn't.